So here we are in South Jordan, a poster made by Ganesh very kindly, we thought was a good introduction to our paper. And we're going to be talking about the early Neolithic and some of the local differences through a lens of what's going on in South Jordan and also a lens of mortuary practice. We're going to focus on mortuary practice to a great extent. And our title is obviously a little bit of a play on the various people who've said, where are the dead at various points in the early Neolithic. So the typical view of the southern Levantine Neolithic, these settlements with repeated buildings which are assumed to be houses, forming settled villages. And for some reason it's not advancing, but let's just, there we go. And of course with mortuary practice, there's been a lot written on this through the PPNA and even from the Natufian onwards, and with a lot of the focus on the more spectacular things like the human modelled skulls, so the plaster modelled skulls and so on. So we're going to give an account of something slightly different here. But first of all, the focus of our work, Southern Jordan. Now this, slightly surprisingly, is the third paper on the south of Jordan. And I'm sure I can speak for Cheryl too when I say that we're very grateful to have been invited to talk here, particularly after 3 excellent lectures in the series, so we hope we don't let the side down. The area we're talking about is quite a long way south of Juan Ho's excavations in the north of Jordan, but it overlaps with the area that Marion Bentz presented last time. Badger is very close to the site of Beda on the bottom of the map here. And you can see the landscape, very varied, a lot of extreme relief going from the Jordan Valley, which of course below sea level, where it gets into the Dead Sea up by Dra, right up to the Jordan Plateau, and along the edge here are some of the highest parts of the Jordanian Plateau. So extreme relief, very different environments, very different rainfall, etc. The things that we think in many ways characterize the early Neolithic of southern Jordan are small settlement size, maybe shared with quite a lot of other areas, of course, in the earlier Neolithic. And by early Neolithic, we're mostly focusing on the PPNA. We'll just touch on the very beginning of the middle PPNB and the early PPNB, of course, in the south of Jordan. Then there is incredible marked intra and inter-site architectural variation. And this is one of the things that's very different from the opening slide I showed you across on the west side of the Jordan, where a number of sites have been excavated which appear to show the repeating patterns of buildings described as houses. Also in this architectural variation, there are a lot of communal structures, and we'll come to those. But the point is that the architecture is very different. It's not all about houses. It's not all about residential buildings. And finally here, and most important for our presentation tonight, there's a whole diverse range of mortuary practices going on throughout the PPNA and throughout the region that we're talking about. Now, first off, the small settlement size. Not going to dwell on this. It's just that it's a simple fact of most of the excavations. Most of the sites are less than 2,000 square meters from the early PPNA, the sites of WF16 that I've worked on with Stephen Mython, the site of Dra, probably the biggest of the sites we have in the area, still less than a hectare. I worked on with Ian Kite. And then we get into the later part of the PPNA, the phase WF16, much the same size. The site of ZAD2, which you can see here on the photograph, excavated by Philip Edwards, a similar size. El Hemma, excavated by Cheryl, we're not quite sure because it's largely buried by a late PPNB site, so we don't actually know the full extent of that one. And this continues, this pattern continues in the middle PPNB. Beda, where Cheryl and I have excavated and found that some of the erosion goes back to the Neolithic times. So we're estimating at the lower end of the range that Brian Bird had estimated for Beda, just 1,500 square meters. And Shkaret Mazed, which we've taken from one of Moritz Kinsel's publications, about 1,000 square meters. So all quite small, not really this fitting into this idea of major settlement size growth in the early Neolithic. Then, as I said, we have this huge diversity in our architecture. This is the site of WF16 towards the southern end of our study area. And here you can see no two buildings seem to be the same. there's an enormous amount of difference, and in function it appears, as well as shape and size and internal features. And I'll come back in a little bit to the building inside the yellow box there, and also to others. At Dra, we also have quite a range of diversity, and we've got three main building types, and we excavated a much smaller area here, so there may be more to discover across the site. But when Ian and I worked here, we uncovered basically three types of building. One, which in this picture is the highest of these, which you can see has got a low mud wall around it, which had post holes, which seem to have held up a lightweight shelter. And these buildings have grinding stones in the center, and we think they're some sort of communal food preparation area. Then the other main type of building that we've talked about are these granaries. And you can see here below the mud structure were arrangements of stones set upright in the ground with notches in the top, and there's some evidence for timbers spanning these to create a raised floor, keeping the contents of the building dry. And on one of the floors, Emma Jenkins found a large concentration of what she thought was barley phytoliths. So we're fairly sure that these are not only storage buildings, but specifically granaries. And in this particular part of the site, you can see at the bottom this stone-walled building. And we have a number of these, and in fact, the first building ever excavated in the PPNA here, excavated by Hamzi Mahasni and Ian way back in '94, was one of these stone-walled buildings, revetted into the side of the hill. And we think these are probably the most likely candidates for residential buildings at Dra, but a lot of architectural diversity. Now, I said we'd come back to the building in the yellow box at WF16, and this is it. This is a close-up of it. And you can see that here we've got a partitioned semi-subterranean building, and the most recent occupation use that we can see is this mud plaster floor with a groundstone, a cup hole mortar set in it. But just poking out through the floor, you can maybe see some of these upright stones with notch tops. And what it looks like is that before this plaster floor was put in, there was a raised floor suspended on wooden beams, and this building, before it became used with the mud plaster floor, was another one of these granary buildings. And we've got three of these perhaps at W16 so far. And we think these are communal because they're open, they're separate bits of building, they're not incorporated inside other houses, and they're in this very public position where everybody can see what's going in, what's coming out, and people can assess how much everybody's taking from the store and so on. Now I'm going to pass over to Cheryl for this one because it's one of her excavations at Al Hamma.
So at Al Hamma, this theme of architectural diversity that we see at W16 and Dra, for example, continues there. At Al Hamma, the site supports several multiple, very well-built kind of circular structures with stone coursing, but we have several diverse, unique structures, and these are just a couple of them here. For example, this small structure above up on the left with the recessed kist is very much a one-off structure of very much unknown function, but it's also openly accessible to the east, suggesting that it is somehow, despite its small size, has somehow, sorry, someone was asking me to turn on my video, was suggestive that it was actually being used for the community. This larger structure that we see on the bottom here on below, it's in some ways one of the best examples we might have in southern Jordan for a domestic PPNA structure, with its raised in situ working platforms, with these cup hole mortars, in situ implements left on the floors. But it's large, it's almost 8 meters across in diameter. So it's very roomy. It's a place where these kinds of daily activities, processing, chit-chatting, so on and so forth, can be undertaken with quite a few people in here. And access to this, this structure, it's not restricted, which is indicated by kind of this ramp passageway that you see on the south end of the structure, where it says flex burial on the floor. And this building was also intentionally closed with this deceased woman who was placed on the floor, and then the superstructure then pushed into the interior of that structure. Bill?
Okay, back here to WF16, and here we found what at the time was the big surprise to us, which is this very large building. It's about 20 meters down its long axis. And as you can see, it's got a whole set of different features. So there's this long trench that goes through the middle of the building, and it's surrounded on one side, you can see quite clearly the raised benches that go around it. These were probably on the other side as well, but they've been eroded away by the edge of the hill. There's a later building, structure 100, masking part of the building as well. But we think it was a pretty symmetrical structure. And you can see at the apex on either side of the central trench are two cut pole mortars, one on either side, and they're both placed on low plaster platforms, so they're both slightly raised. And we find it very hard not to think that there's some display purpose going on here, some public activity that people can watch and see what's happening again. The regularity of the building and the extent of the symmetry to it, the sheer amount of work put in to build it, how well it's built with these nice scalloped edges, and I haven't shown it here, but many of you have seen before, on the upright faces of some of these benches, there are zigzag patterns and so on built, made out of the mud plaster. So there's a lot of work, a lot of effort. It's a very nice building, and we think that it has a communal role, and this building, unlike most of our public buildings, probably would have been big enough to take everybody living on this small settlement here. So this is a very communal building, very public, and probably fulfilling some practical functions with the tools and things within it, but those practical functions perhaps happening in a ritualized manner. Cheryl.
So a little bit at the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of communal architecture, back here at Alhema at structure 5, we have this very big building. It's about 10 meters in length, but it's completely devoid of interior architecture or installations. It's very, very stark difference in compared to what we just saw for WF16. Its large size suggests that it's important because the building of this particular structure actually involved the tearing down of a pre-existing smaller circular structure. If you take a look at the photo on the right there, in sort of the further afield, you can sort of see that curvature there. And what they did then is they ripped down that wall, they installed a fairly straight wall, and they backed it into another wall that you can see in the left-hand corner in the photo on the left there. And to connect it with that back of that pre-existing structure. So there's no special features here. It's not part of some big symbolic material culture. It's just a large quotidian structure that was designed to hold people engaging in everyday activities. Bill?
We went back to Beda at one point as part of a long-standing project we've been running with Mohammed Najjar as well, to look at the presentation of the site, which we've been developing, and repair some of the reconstructions and so on there. But while we were there, we investigated this large building from one of the earlier phases on the site that had only been partially dug by Kirkbride, and because it had been left with a freestanding section running across it, was collapsing. So we investigated this with a combination of research and also to help stabilize the site. And what Kirkbride had reported was a large building with a stone floor, and in that she's partially correct, but the mud on top of the stone floor that she thought was the occupation deposits was actually a clay layer built across as part of a series of floor laying things. So the building had a particularly sturdy, strong floor. It's much bigger than all the other buildings in the same phase. It also opens through that entrance that you can see on the right-hand side of the slide into an open courtyard. So again, given the size, the lack of internal features, the very distinctive different floor, most of the others are plaster floors, we think this building has a special function, and because of its scale, we think probably public. It was larger than this in its first construction, but as I said, the erosion on this site was happening during the Neolithic, and the left-hand edge of the building had fallen away into the Wadi, and you can see it's been reconstructed, slightly less well-built, and cutting off the left-hand side curvature with a sort of straight section there. So it's important to them that it's big and it's used and it's heavily used, and some of the floor mud was worn through onto the stone. So, a quotidian thing in that there's no real sign of heavy symbolism that you get in some ritual structures, but possibly used for some functions such as a dance house or something with this heavily used floor, this large building. So all sorts of possibilities. But the important point is that this is continuing the trend that we see through the PPNA into the early middle PPNB at Beda. Oops.
So I think what's important to emphasize here too is we're talking a lot about community and the role of community in these societies in southern Jordan during the pre-Neolithic A, but this region was very much part of larger developments going on throughout the Near East. And one very good example of that is first experimentation with cultivation. And we have evidence for pre-domestication cultivation of barley at the site of El Hema this was work done by Chantal White some years ago now, but very important work demonstrating that these grains were being harvested green. They were being harvested from plots that had gone a bit run wild with weeds of cultivation. And there was starting to be selection for larger seed size. And we're also starting to see this at other sites, such as Sharara. Jade Whitlam is working on this currently, where we also have exploitation of other cultivars, including lentils, and also exploitation of figs as well. In terms of animal exploitation, again, this is very much part of what we're seeing in the broader Near East. In particular, for example, at El Hema, we're seeing very much a broad spectrum exploitation strategy where they're hunting large-bodied goats, going after gazelle, occasional oxen, some pigs thrown in there as well. They have a strange focus on foxes. And then they sort of are going after all kinds of other things as well, including fast-moving game such as hares, tortoises, which are less fast-moving, and also exploiting other animals for their furs. There's also camels in there, which is quite interesting. There's lots and lots of birds at places like El Hema, mostly chukar pigeon here, but also they're exploiting ducks and some raptors as well. We're seeing a similar pattern emerging at Draw, although there's slightly less diversity in the spectrum of species being exploited. And at W16, we actually have a very, very different pattern, which is now speaking to more local developments within southern Jordan, where we have a very focused exploitation of goats, probably ibex, followed by some hunting of gazelle and also oxen. But you don't see very much of all the other attacks that they're going for, with the exception of birds, which Judith White has analyzed all the fauna from here, and it's actually largely all raptors, with a few little poor chukar pigeons running around. And what's quite interesting about the assemblage at WF16 is that what we're starting to see is, based on some of the metrical data from there, is an intensive hunting of female animals, which is very much not what's in line with our expectations for hunting of prime-aged game for maximum meat offset. So there's a lot to think about here, even during the PPNA, in terms of setting the stage, so to speak, for nascent animal management practices. Bill, what's up?
Okay, you don't want to touch on beta there.
Oh, right, sorry, I missed the slide miss. And so sorry about that. At beta, which is middle PPNB, what we're seeing there is kind of, we're seeing nascent management there of goats with heavy exploitation of juvenile male animals, which is very much in line with these kinds of harvesting strategies that are designed to maximize offtake from extant herds while promoting female survivorship.
Okay, I mentioned at the beginning that we would talk a little bit about the late PPNA, and this is something that I think both our work and the work of Phil Edwards at Zachariah ZAD2, we've come together on this to some extent, is that there appears to be a very distinctive late PPNA phase. It's characterized in the first place by an absence of projectile points. There are no alkyne points, and actually virtually no other points at all at present. The other characteristics are mostly architectural, in that the buildings are built above ground for the first time. The walls are no longer semi-subterranean, but as you can see, they're building above ground buildings with freestanding stone architecture, sometimes with mud incorporated or coating the stones. So quite distinctive architecturally in terms of the finds. And it has some things in common with the early PPNB in that they're beginning to experiment with opposed platform flint knapping. So there are things that either they're developing independently or they're learning from early PPNB populations elsewhere. And one of the things that has come as something of a surprise recently is that the early PPNB in Jordan appears to coincide with the late PPNA. As you'll all know, for a long time, there was very little evidence for an early PPNB, except some hints at it at places like Gilat 7 and so on. The excavations at Motza near Jerusalem showed that there was a proper early PPNB in the southern Levant. And recently, Sumio Fuji has been excavating the site of Harat Jahera, where there is a very classic early PPNB. And you can see that our late PPNA sites have got the blue dots on them. WF16 has a phase from both aspects of the PPNA, and Harat Jahera, the early PPNB site, in yellow. So all the way in the south of Jordan here, and it's remarkably, if you like, authentic, straightforward early PPNB. And I don't want to talk about it much, it's Sumio's work there. But what we can say, we think, is that there are two populations living in parallel and possibly learning from each other, because when we get on to the middle PPNB, it looks a bit like the middle PPNB in the south of Jordan is developing out of both previous traditions. So we have two things coming together here on the ground. The other thing to mention about these sites in the south of Jordan is that the early the PPNA sites, all the PPNA sites that we've talked about so far, are in very open and visible locations. Not only that, but the locations are actually quite well marked. So you've got the site of Dra in front of just where the rocks at the edge of the Jordan Valley, the Rift Valley, rear up vertically behind it. And those are very sheer rock faces. And the bedding planes have been pulled up vertically, so they no longer lie horizontally. The site of El Hema, on the top right of the slide, is situated at the right-hand end of the modern reservoir here, and just below this big volcanic plug that sits behind it. So again, the location highly visible on a hill slope looking out over what would then have been quite a nice environment, well watered and with its own floodplain and so on for growing plants in. And below that, you can see the location of the site of WF16, which you can maybe just make out as a pale patch on the very last of the yellow knolls before we hit the volcanic rock there. So again, very visible, sitting in front with a background of a black volcanic steep rocky mountain. So all three, these highly visible locations, extra clearly marked out by the landscape, and also located in positions where we think they would have been ideally suited for hunting, passing game. They're ideally suited for targeting different environments to hunt different animals, and also all of them with local floodplains suitable for early experimentation with cultivation and so on. Cheryl.
So we'll just turn very briefly to these PPNA mortuary practices. And when we think of these, we tend to think of these classic PPNA burials, these flex burials, where you have individuals that are interred in a pit, tightly flexed, knees bound up. We see this at WF16 over and over again, also at Dra and Netiv Hagdud. But there are other practices that are going on, as evidenced, for example, at WF16. And what we're looking at here, oh, come back, go back one slide, thank you. Where we see at WF16 and burial 032 is a series of skeletal elements, including cranial vaults, which have been, looks like they've been stacked on top of each other, mixed up with other skeletal elements belonging to a primary burial. So there's lots of rummaging around going on here. Next slide. Also at W16, there's an example of a cranium situated along with a bunch of long bones that have been wrapped up in a gypsum-lined bag. And there's also an example of a foundation burial. And what's interesting about that, in addition to its sort of foundationness, is that this was reopened and rummaged around a bit, and there were additional long bones inserted with that particular burial. So we have, again, these sort of classic PP&A burials, but there is lots of variation going on, particularly as we see it at WF16. So we received an invitation from the Department of Antiquities to work at another PP&A site, which is really starting to provide some striking new evidence and a new twist on the PP&A mortuary practices. And the site's name is Sharara, and it's located in the Wadi Hassa. That's the same Wadi system that El Hama is located in. And the site is extremely remote. It's located in an environment that is not at all suited for cultivation or even hunting. The terrain is phenomenally difficult. And so we first went out there to excavate, I think in 2016, sounds about right. And we've since had 3 seasons there. And part of going to Sharara, how to get there, again, it's quite remote, it's the journey. And so, Bill, next slide. So we head up there for 3 weeks. There are no roads. There are no real pathways. We have to pack up all of our gear. So we took our team out of 12 adventurous, intrepid folks, and we loaded up everything on the backs of donkeys. This is at the bottom of the Hassa, loading things up. We camped out the night before, and then we packed up in the morning all of our generators, tables, propane tanks, kitchen supplies, so on and so forth, and we headed off into the terrain. And this is the team, led by the donkeys, hiking up and out from Gor Safi, and you can see the Gor in the background. And as we start heading up, the terrain becomes more and more difficult. It's really quite a challenge to get everything and everyone over all of this terrain, especially with all the gear that everyone is carrying.
I thought you were going to say especially with me, but
yeah, go ahead.
And this is us just walking. You can see, indeed, the donkeys lead the way. The donkeys can go much faster than us, having to wait for us, even we're heavily loaded. But we go through quite a wild landscape for a long, long way up into the hills, down into the wadis and up the hills. And this is us heading up towards the pass that takes us into quite a separate world from the world where you can still see the gore and civilization and the Dead Sea and so on. And at this point, we're just crossing through that pass, and we're into what almost seems like like the land that time forgot or something. There's very little evidence of other people coming and going here, except for a few goat herds. Unlike the rest of Jordan, it's pretty abandoned. What you can see with the yellow arrow there is the late PPNB site, which is on that plateau there, that low plateau, and that's actually. It's a small late PPNB site, but still very busy architecturally, but its location is pretty open compared to sites further up the Wadi. There's another pass that goes off to the left there, which may have been a pass used by the Romans when they were living and occupying in their settlements at the south end of the Dead Sea. So it's both connected to the plateau and to the Gor. And that's where
that's where we camp. This is the site of late PPNB Hamarash, which you can sort of see that lump in the background. And this is where we set up our shop. Now, that hike alone takes about 5 to 6 hours, depending on your load and your state of fitness. But Sharara is not near Hamarash. This is where we camp. So our adventure still continues to get to the site of Sharara. So every day we hike down from that plateau that Hamarash is located on. We hike down into the Wadi. The Wadi Hassa is always running. The water level it's fairly steady because the dam, which you saw, I think the picture from El Hama previously, kind of controls the water flow, but it can be pretty swift at times. And we have to carry everything, including all of our classic tools, including turias and tufas, gufas, and so on and so forth. Up through the water. Then we climb out of the water and we do a change of costume, put on new shoes, and then we start hiking up and up this steep kind of scree-filled hillside, and we get to the top and we're still not there. You can see Sharara is on the next hill over. And so we have to climb down and then back up. And if you look closely in the middle of the screen, you can see those small dots of people climbing up the side of Sharara, which is located at the very, very tippy top of this hill.
And the important thing to bear in mind is that this is not just the effect of erosion and so on that's happened since the PPMA. Our geomorphologist advises this gorge is a Pleistocene gorge, and that the landscape in broad terms would have been much the same in the early Holocene. So it's always going to be difficult, always concealed. You can't see it at all from the gorge. Unlike all the other PPMA sites we've talked about, it's invisible in the landscape. There's spectacular mountains all around. So you could say it shares that with them, but it's very hard to see. At the back of this slide, you can actually see the limestone plateau at the top, a long walk up through the wadi, although it looks quite close in this picture. But it's a very remote site and very hard to get to. And importantly, it doesn't match the location that you'd expect of a site early in the history of agriculture. There's very little available ground for growing crops. The water's a long way down the hill, and would have been a long way down the hill. And it's not a very great place for humans to go hunting game. You can't see it coming, and it can almost certainly move much faster than you through this landscape. Fortunately, nowadays we can get help from people in helicopters to take an overview of the site. And here you can see the distribution of some of the main structures on the site, which had already been partially exposed before we got there. And one of the things that's very obvious from this slide is that unlike all the other early Neolithic sites we know in the south of Jordan, where the architecture is pretty densely placed, even if it's not always all in use at the same time, architectural distribution is always very dense. Buildings butt up against each other, cut through each other, and so on, as I showed with Dry in particular. Here at Sharara, there's space between them, space that may, we think, have been used for garden plots and so on, but certainly not the same density of occupation. Cheryl.
Right, so this site of Sharara had some previous excavation work done on it, which we won't get into the details of at this point. But the point here is that there is domestic architecture at Sharara. It's elliptical, it's circular, it's similar to some of what we have seen at W16 and Draw and so on and so forth, that you can see in this photo here. Bill? And there are other elements of the site that we see, for example, at W16 and also at Draw. For example, we have a notched upright stone here that we saw at those sites being used to hold up floors for granaries. And here we have on the right what is the interior of a kind of domestic structure with a very nicely molded raised platform with a very nice cup hole mortar set inside of it. You can see there's lots of remodeling events going on in the background there, with walls that have been installed and taken out. And at some point, though, this was turned into an interior. As you can see, there's a bit of plaster on the back of that wall to the left there, indicating also that it is part of an interior structure. And this is just a view of the flotation station. This is Jade Whitlam, who's at Oxford University, who's doing all of this work. And so she would schlep up the hill every day to retrieve new samples and then come back down here to do all of her flotation work. But
at Sharara, what seems to happen is that there is a major remodeling event at some point in the history, which changes the focus of the site completely. You can see that wall that we saw the plastered face of the other day is remodeled. It goes from being a curved wall to being a straight wall. It's cutting off the domestic area with the cup hole mortar and so on. And to the right-hand side, you can see a series of bits and pieces of wall that have all been cut down, have been reduced in height to a fairly common level. And the spaces between these residual wall stubs are filled with rubble. They're creating a big level platform area. And one of the things that outlines this that we investigated was what looked like a low, very superficial stone wall that had been previously exposed, exposing these stones. So we cleaned up around it to have a look at what was actually going on, as it seems to mark the edge of this platform area. And we dug a box section through it because we weren't quite sure that it really was this superficial feature. And quite quickly, we exposed very different architecture from what we'd expected. And this is the box section looking through it. And you can see that the stones are actually just the top course of a substantial walled feature, which is plaster lined on the inside on both sides. So it's demarcating a channel, a substantial channel over 1 meter wide. And the soil on the right-hand side is mostly redeposited material that's been accumulating against the channel edge. And on the left-hand side, it's actually cut through the very soft bedrock here. So a substantial amount of effort has gone into this, not only cutting down the walls, putting in the rubble fill, but building this very large channel feature. And here is a section through it. You can see the height of it, and you can see the fill of it after it's been occupied, full of all sorts of bits of old burnt Pisé chunks and sediment and so forth. So it's a pretty massive undertaking, as this is all at this end of the channel cut through the bedrock. Even though it's fairly soft bedrock, it's a lot of work that's been undertaken. And at one end, this big channel splits into 2 smaller channels. They don't flow out of it, as you can see, if both ends sort of slope down into the main channel, so they're not acting as drains or anything like that. One of them runs off in a curved manner to one side, a very narrow curved thing. The other one goes pretty rapidly to the edge of the hill slope, the steep hill slope. Now, if we look back up from that end with the small channels up the main channel, you can see at the far end, there's a stairway going up, or looking at it the other way, a stairway going down, which is more the way we've come to think about how this is representing things. And at the base of the channel, there's a whole sequence of ashy floors and so on. Then the final stage over this platform that's been created and demarcated by these channels is that this large mud plaster floor is placed down. It's very thin and fragile, a bit like the one at W16. This one, however, is a bit more stable where it survived because it's been burnt, which has obviously set the mud plaster. But you can see that there's basically a whole series of construction work operations conducted to make this very large, substantial level platform. And you can see just at the front of the slide there that when the floor goes in, it appears to be continuous, overlapping the edge of the channel in a sort of rounded banister at the top there. So it goes in as a single event wrapping around the channel. There is an earlier stage to the channel wall that you can see below that. So there's modification that goes on even in this short period of a major construction program. And to us, the amount of effort and work put into this was really quite surprising in this remote site. The staircase end gets heavily remodeled when this new plaster floor goes in. The end is actually turned to twist slightly. It's narrowed, as you can see in the top slide, with the work there. So it becomes more difficult to get into, made a bit twisty. You can see the steps being remodeled in the middle of the small pictures. And then on the bottom of the small pictures, you can maybe see what appear to be the remains of a stone superstructure built on top of the end here, again, forcing the entrance of the staircase to be taken at an angle. So it's narrowing and twisting your processes as you go down. The other thing to note is that although this is the end cut into the bedrock and therefore theoretically the hardest work, this is the deepest end of the channel. It actually gets shallower as you go towards the far end, both because the hill's sloping down, but because the ground surface is coming up. So with the stairs and the superstructure and the twist and the narrowness and so on, there's a lot of emphasis on going down to a very deep place. And you can see the blackening on the floor there. So we suspect as you went down into it, it may well have been filled with smoke deliberately. So you're going down into quite a strange place. Helped, of course, by a very handy little stone put in the side there on the edge of the steps, which seems to be placed there to rest your hand on as you go down. I mean, they obviously didn't want anybody to fall down and flatten themselves. And you can see the multiple clay reflooring events at the bottom there. And it's a mixture of just compacted mud and ash and so on building up. Now, the plaster wall of the big trench in itself is quite interesting, because once you've managed to make it down here, what you aren't seeing very much of, possibly small glimpses in there, is that they have hidden in the wall these upright grinding stones. So on the big picture there, you've got a cup hole mortar with 2 cup holes and multiple shallow depressions around it. And on the top left, you've got a large basin that's been put into the wall. And you can see how these were placed facing the interior, but hidden behind quite a thick layer of mud plaster. The artifacts are quite striking, and once they're fully exposed, you can see that the bottom one in particular is enormous, and they're not made out of the local lithology. Somebody has, or several people have, brought this up to the site. And our feeling is that with this very large ground stone at the bottom, and indeed the next one to it, with the single cup hole, double cup hole, but with the multiple working stations around it, that these are probably tools that were worked at by a group of people. They're not individual tools. You know, you can imagine a group of people clustered around doing whatever tasks were being undertaken, probably food preparation tasks. So the effort required to bring them and their nature as communal tools suggests that in some way we're seeing a symbol of communal work and togetherness. Now, in contrast, there's just another photograph of the main channel. Gives you an idea of scale. That show at the end there, at the top of the stairs, and that's the standing stones. And this is what the narrow, twisted side channel, too small for a person really to get up, or certainly an adult, and it doesn't go anywhere. It just comes to a rounded terminus. And here you can just see a couple of slides showing how it's built up inside. That side channel isn't cut into anything. It's built up. It's freestanding walls with stone and mud and coated with mud plaster. And to the right of that slide, you can see the natural gravel, which has been cut back a bit. And all of that area in between ends up being filled with rubble to level it so that the red mud plaster floor can come over at a fairly level height across the whole thing. And in the top slide there, you can see where the back of where the junction between the big channel and the small channels is, and you can see just there, the big grinding stone has been put in freestanding, but has been backed by building rubble. That's big chunks of pise as well as those big rocks. So it's old building rubble, presumably from whatever buildings were leveled in this area before this construction was built. So there you have it. It's a very large platform that has suddenly been put into this very small, sparsely populated settlement, all brought together with this red floor. And one of the ways this project then developed was to try and find out what exactly was going on. The floor, although damaged here, as you can see by erosion, did extend all the way across. We were picking it up in the profiles. You can see both in the stratigraphic change from the overlying loose silty sediments and the underlying built up deposits from the archaeological site, but also patches of this red floor that were just very, very hard to follow in plan at that point. And you can see this again to the left on the opposite side of the trench. You can see this very sharp divide between the upper silts and the lower fills, with little bits of the red flooring showing up there. That also perhaps gives you an idea of the scale of this platform in this location. I think there's about 10 people gathered around that tarpaulin. We had to cover the site up at night because it's relatively fragile and it does get a bit exposed there. So we've got quite a complicated design and build thing where there was a domestic structure. We call it the fig house because there were huge deposits of burnt figs inside it. And one of the things that still grows in the area are figs along the gorges. The south side of that's demolished. The walls are cut down and the whole area is leveled. And then this area is demarcated by the large channel cut into the bedrock and the installation of the cup hole mortars filled in behind. And everything is sorted out as a big level platform with backfill and probably some of the soft rock material that's been dug out of the channel. And at that point, we discovered what happens. There are a number of burials inserted, and we'll get to those just in a second. And then, probably very quickly after that, the clay floor is installed. Probably this is all happening in a fairly short space of time, because, as I say, these mud plaster surfaces are actually relatively fragile. They're not going to bear being exposed to very long, although there's some evidence that we had a roof or awning here. We have the burnt traces of various timbers and things that seem to have fallen across the red floor. And at the moment, it looks like there's some sort of intentional process here. It's so systematic, and this is what reddens the floor. Is the burning of the whole area. So it appears to be a very intentional design and build construction that goes in. Various phases happen and different operations happen within that, but all as part of one steady process. Cheryl.
Right, so one of the purposes of this platform, in addition to bolstering up and creating the large channels that we've been looking at, it's to create a burial ground. And it's not a burial ground, however, for primary burials. These aren't going to be classic PP&A flex burials that we're going to be looking at, but they're all for secondary burials. Now, to date, we've exposed 7 of these burials. 4 of them you can see are clustered together, while the other 3 are further out. They have been inserted right up against the passage walls, indicating that those certainly came in after the installation of those passageways. And you'll see that there's actually one that was sort of snuck in there on the outside of the small channel, not in the main platform area, but just kind of, wedged in there very quickly at some point in time. Slide, please. This is just an overview of the burial pits, which we're going to kind of go through in a minute. These pits are all cut directly into that construction fill. These pits, as you can see, they're very, very shallow. They're only about maybe 15, 20 centimeters deep maximum. There's no preparation of these pits. They're a bit ragged. They're just a bit kind of banged out in a sense. And there's no specialized installation save for one installation here, this stone kist, which was constructed of multiple sandstone upright slabs. Again, just sort of wedged into the construction fill, although very, very solid in construction. Slide, please. Just to go over feature 1, that's the little small burial that we found first in, I guess, in 2017, wedged up against the small channel wall. It's very poorly preserved. This was only a couple of centimeters underneath the actual surface. Footfall and traffic had been going over it. There's a couple skull fragments in there. You can kind of see, perhaps in the middle of that little blob there, that's the skull fragment. A couple of tibia, perhaps they were tied together. I don't believe they were positioned in that way, but they may have been tied together and then thrown in a bag. There's a couple of femurs and ulnar humors. There's very few vertebrae, very few ribs, very few finger and foot bones. This does look like one individual, but we can't be certain. Slide, please. All right, so let's go to feature 2 here. So feature 2 had several markers, and they were actually superimposed on each other. So marker 1 was one of these limestone kind of roughed out circular shapes. You can see, if you look very closely at your screen, you can see sort of all the flaking going along the edges. Was it broken before installation? Probably not. It probably broke in situ. Now that marker was sitting on top of another marker. On an earlier slide, you may have seen marker 1 kind of floating about 10 centimeters above marker 2. There was a layer of silts and junk in between. And this marker is sitting on top of that stone kist. Now, we have on the stone kist on the left there, which is being covered by marker 2, that sandstone slab is actually serving as a marker for the burial that was inserted next to that, where you can see all of the skulls inserted next to that slab there. Next slide, please. So going to feature 4 here briefly, we have this massive commingled human remains. You can see you've got 3 crania there. Now, I'd like to emphasize that they are just the cranial vaults. The facial skeleton has actually, it's not there, save for one where you have a few fragments and some of the maxilla preserved, but the rest of them, it's just the vault parts. And then we have other cranial parts as well. They're kind of, you can see here in the right slide that they are then kind of stacked underneath a bunch of long bones. But basically it's just a big mess. There's arm and leg elements, there's ribs, there's vertebrae, there's hand bones, there's foot bones, it's all mixed in. There's not really much organization here, save perhaps for the skulls, okay? It's like they've been put in a bag and they were sort of just dumped there in this very shallow pit. Next slide, please. Now, just going back briefly to the stone kist that we were looking at before underneath marker 1 and 2. Bill, can you, next slide, please? And we have something very similar, okay? This kist was jam-packed with human remains, okay? They're commingled, they're highly disorganized. We have all kinds of body parts in here. We have pelvic remains, again, all the ribs and the foot and hand bones and so on and so forth. But you really just get the impression that they were kind of jamming everything in there to get into this kist. And underneath all of that, you can see there were several skulls were placed very carefully on the bottom of that particular, underneath all of those skeletal elements. Let's just take a closer look at those. So you have the skulls that are nested up against the uprights in the back. If you look in your lower right-hand photo there, you can see there's another cranial vault that's kind of been glommed onto the side, kind of like a slug kind of working its way across the other crania there, with all these long bones kind of stacked and squashed very, very close to each other. If you take a look at how close those long bones are wedged on top of each other, those bones were certainly defleshed before they went into that particular kist, okay, in order to get that kind of wedging in there. The other thing that if you take a look very closely at here is that some of the long bones have been broken at some point. And you can see on the left there that the articular ends are missing. And they were never there to begin with, okay? What's also interesting is that for some of these, the ends of those are kind of rounded. They're a bit, I wouldn't go so far to say they've been polished intentionally, but they've been handled, they're no longer rough. The ends of those diaphyses they're not pokey, they're rounded a bit. Next slide, please. If you take a look closer now with those long bones removed, you can also see sort of further evidence for curation is that there are no teeth in the individual on the left. All of your single socketed teeth are missing, and so are the molars, which are notoriously difficult to actually get out. And the skull on the right is also missing most of its teeth. This sort of suggests overall that these skulls have kind of been hanging around for some amount of time. We don't know how long that is, but it is some amount of time in order for all those, ligature and everything to weaken and for those teeth to actually fall out. Next slide, please. Here we have another one of these more shallow pits. Again, it's just kind of a bit of a jumble. We've got these long bones laid out on the bottom. They're kind of, whether they're carefully positioned or there were racks then placed in a bag with all the other material, it's a little unclear. My feeling is it's the latter. But again, they were just kind of dumped in this shallow pit. Next slide, please. This is closer to that smaller channel. And here we have a sort of very different kind of burial here, where you can see that it's much more spread out. And we have sort of a bisection almost of the secondary remains with a big rock kind of stuck in the middle of everything. Next slide, Bill, please. If you take a look at this in the corner, what we uncovered here are something very different from what we saw in the other burials. These are a little bit more, these are more articulated. They have the feel of kind of limbs that were entire limbs that were transported. It's a bit unnerving to excavate. Even in the original photo there, you can see an articulated vertebral column with some of the ribs still in situ along there, but the arms and the legs are not with it. So you really get the sense that we have real parts being transported, and they were still very much in articulation, although not all of them, evidenced by the next photo, where you can see, again, we're back to just sort of a bag filled with bones that have been sort of dumped in the corner here up against the channel. Next slide, Bill. Again, we have this theme kind of repeated a bit. I'd like to just bring a particular attention to these cranial vault fragments that we've seen now in several of the other burials. And I think this is quite interesting because it sort of emphasizes how long some of these bones must have been hanging around. It takes a long time for a skull to start disarticulating like this. And you see all of these cranial fragments along the suture lines being placed or mixed in these bags, as we think that's what's going on here, with all of these other skeletal elements. Again, the rest of this particular one is a real jumble. And our final burial feature, number 7, was inserted right against the large passage wall, right behind one of these large cup hole mortars. And we see some similarities here with what we've seen in the other burial features here at Sherrar, but a couple of interesting differences as well. You can see that here on the left, there's a cut here, and there are the upper layers of that cut held very, very, just a sort of a random assortment of vertebra, ribs, and small foot and hand bones, but they were very spaced apart. They weren't jammed up against each other. But then underneath that, we have these 2 skulls, one which looks like it's facing down, certainly, and the other one's flipped up. Now, of course, the question remains, is that intentionally placed like that? My inclination is to say, again, it was in a bag. If you look at the long bones, you can see that a lot of them, they're actually not laying horizontal, but they're pointing up, again, as if they had been in a bag and they were kind of shaken down. They were shaking the bag and it dropped into there. Next slide, please. So we identified some shared characteristics of these burials here at Sherrar. We have only adult individuals. This is very much in contrast to HEMA and W16, where there's lots of primary, infant, and child burials. So at Sherrar, we have adults. These are people who are established members of the community, and they're people who already have their own personhood, and they're bound into the fabric of that community. And I think for the first time in the PPNA, as far as I'm aware, we're seeing distinction that's being based on age, unlike in the settlements where these burials represent the full demographic spectrum, so to speak. And at Sherrar, for these instances where we have these full crania represented, both males and females. So this is a male and a female in this particular one, and the stone kiss that we saw previously also has a male and female individual. Next slide, please. The bones were defleshed. I think that's fairly clear from the packing of the bones, from the ways in which some of these bones have been handled with the rubbing marks and so on and so forth, the teeth falling out, all these kinds of little taphonomic elements that we were seeing here. We don't know how they were defleshed. They probably weren't actively disarticulated by the recent, they weren't actively disarticulating the recently deceased, at least not with a stone tool. We don't see any cut marks like we see, for example, at Kortik Tepe. We don't see any scraping marks on the long bone diaphyses. We don't see any of this kind of thing. However, I would point out that a skilled person doesn't leave a mark on bone, and the zooarchaeological record is actually a good example of this. There's very, very few cut marks on most, for example, pre-pottery Neolithic zooarchaeological assemblages. Excarnation certainly could have been at play here. We have lots of raptors kicking around. Sherrar is in fact on a migration route, as is actually the whole region, southern Jordan, so that is also a possibility. And the other one is that they were being buried and retrieved. And we saw this foundation burial earlier at W16, where some bones had been added to the primary burial place there. Next slide, please. I think what's really important here to emphasize is that at Sherrar, we're not just getting cranial elements, but we're getting all the skeletal elements. And I think when we're thinking about the pre-Potter Neolithic, where there's the A or B, we tend to be obsessed about skulls, and that's almost understandable. They're highly charismatic, almost, you know, you can relate to them and so on and so forth. I think the differences in the qualities of the bones here become important, okay? Again, skulls are inherently charismatic, but what's remarkable about the other skeletal elements is that they're not remarkable and they're not memorable, okay? These ribs, these vertebrae, these hand and foot bones, they very rapidly lose their association with particular individuals. And you get this sheer number of these similarly sized and shaped bones representing these elements. They're visually, you know, they're homogeneous, there are lots of them, and they're random disorganization within these burial pits. It really makes it difficult for these elements to kind of accrue memory, so to say. So ribs and vertebrae and hand bones and long bones, they're not necessarily reaffirming social memories as they were formed or negotiated, reformed, and even imagined in settlements, but they are representative of something else that is lost pretty much quite soon after disarticulation. Next slide, please. All of these burial pits that we see at Shore, they're deficient in bones, okay? In other words, there's just not enough body parts to represent even a minimum number of individuals. For example, just in these cases where there are several skulls, there's just not nearly enough long bones and ribs and vertebrae to represent and account for those 3 or 4 people as evidenced in the skulls to make up for those individuals. There's also a mismatch in the symmetry of skeletal elements. So you'll get a right side, it will be you'll have a right side, but you'll be missing the left side, and so on and so forth, and just underabundance of other parts. But generally an overabundance of, no, correction, there's never an overabundance of any post-cranial skeletal elements. Next slide, Bill. And another characteristic we send is that some bones are curated, but others also are not curated. Again, just to sort of review this, some are missing teeth, the facial skeleton is missing, we have these pieces of the crania floating around, some of these ends of the long bones have been rounded and rubbed, kind of rocked around a bit. But again, what's important to emphasize is not necessarily all elements were being curated either. Some might be relatively, new bones compared to other ones. Next slide, please. So what we try to think about here, just very briefly, is sort of the whole picture here in terms of the burial practices, because we have to think about the temporality and the tempo and also the fidelity of knowledge transfer that's going on. So within the settlements, we have this primary mortuary activity, and that's continuous, that's happening all the time, okay? And we get intrasite variation as demonstrated at W16, but we also get intersite variation. Some of the things that they do at W16, you don't see at Draw, you don't see that at Nativ Hagdud, and so on and so forth. So in some level, the fidelity of knowledge transfer, it's very high within the community. When we're starting to think now about the burials at Shirar, we have to think now about the collection of persons, okay? So that is a longer duration activity, and it's kind of happening in a stepwise kind of way. There is the selection process, and we don't know when that takes place. Does that take place when someone's alive, after they've recently deceased? Is it sort of random? We just take the bones that happen to be still hanging around, and so on and so forth. But then there's this defleshing that occurs by whatever way that might be. And then there's this period of curation, which can be short, but also can take a very, very long time. And we think the fidelity of the knowledge transfer in that sense is poor, because looking at the situation at Shirara, some burials have full crania, some don't. We have that burial where we have these kind of very articulated, kind of disturbing pieces with the full vertebral column and so on and so forth. It seems like they all know the theme, but they kind of show up to the site with different stuff. And what we don't know, and the question is, does this reflect the duration of that collection stage? For example, the longer you collect the material, perhaps over decades, you get this kind of human mediated attrition. You just unintentionally lose stuff as they become disarticulated. Or does it have to do with the timing of this? when your community has to respond with what they have on that particular day. These are things that we still have to think about, and I think these are perhaps answered in part by better exploration, additional excavation of more mortuary practices and burials in these kinds of settlement sites. Next slide, please. One of the things I think that is very important here at Sharara is that the collection of bones over time and the mixing of bones, it's a key feature of what is going on there. There's no strong ideas of individuality associated with this material by the virtue of the skeletal elements that are included, by the virtue of the curation of this material, and that it's very difficult to assign individuals. It's all these commingled material burials. These burials, in a sense, and the bones in them, they stand for people in the community. When they were picked at their settlement of death, they were then put aside and they became, in a sense, representative of that community. And by this deliberate kind of mixing of bones, it's so that everybody can kind of get to Sharara. This is bringing people within the community together. And that's why it's important to get all those bones in. It's why it's important to kind of squash all of these long bones and so on and so forth, and that we saw, for example, in the Kiss and some of these other burials. And then we have this journey to Sharara, and we showed you these pictures of our own journey there, but it is a journey, no matter where you're coming from. And that journey itself kind of disarticulates individuals from the settlements from which they came. Basically, we have a process of transformation that's underway. And these bones become more of an active reference to the mobilities and practices associated with the transport of bones to Sharara, rather than the mortuary practices and the memories associated with the primary treatment of bodies in settlements. So I think there's a different kind of social memory that's being transmitted here through the action of bringing the dead to Sharara. And this process of transformation, it's engendered by this journey. It's part of the mystery. There's something going on with all the big channel. As Bill mentioned, it's probably was smoke-filled, dark, kind of mysterious. You're headed to this hidden place in the mountains. And these individuals are now completely disarticulated from your home community. And you've mixed all the bones from within your community. You've got this intra-community mixing going on. And then you bring all of these sacks from other places. And so now you have different communities mixing together at Sharara. It's a form of translocality. It's the joining together of communities. Bill?
Yes, and one of the more surprising, and as ever with these things, found at the very end of the project finds was this stone head. A little bit reminiscent of the stone masks known from west of the Jordan, but in this case, a very solid lump of stone with this rather surprised-looking individual. So not a skull on display at all, but a stone head watching over the cemetery, because it was placed in the northern wall, the wall that separates the platform area from the domestic building represented by the fig house, facing out over them. So quite interesting in itself that they've used this rather than one of the many skulls that they had available to them.
So we've sort of built up a picture here of a story of people bringing their dead to Sharara as part of this knitting community, not just with knitting people together through death within communities, but also between communities as well. And we just want to take a few seconds to talk a little bit about El Hema, which is further down the Wadi Hassan. Now remember, it's late PPNA, so it's a little bit 500 years later than Sharara, located next to this wacky Great Mountain. And there's something very, very different going on there. Next slide, please, Bill. So at Hema, we have a specialized mortuary structure, which is intentionally built for the installation of all kinds of mortuary furniture and markers and stone kists and so on and so forth for the dead. And this is just a brief overview. On the left, this is the structure itself. It's broken up a little funny. I'll show you a bit better in the next picture, but it just gives you a brief overview of, we've got multiple markers that are denoting where burials are. And some of them are also, like we saw at Chirara, actually multi-layered. For example, in the case of up on the top there, you can see there's a kind of stone, a Pisa kind of plug covering this whacking heap of black kind of basaltic type stones. Next slide, please, Bill. And that's just a drawing of the full structure there. And within, underneath these markers, there's a variety of kind of furniture, of stone kists, containing seated burials and occasionally flex burials as well. These are just a couple examples. Bill, the next slide, please. And here we have multiple individuals. Again, we're being, in contrast to Chirara, we have males and females represented from all ages. So we have infants, we have juveniles, we have young adults, and we have old adults as well. And something is going on here. We're having a major shift from what we saw at Chirara. We're seeing something much more individualistic. It's more settled. It's arguably even a more familial relationship, because many of these adult burials have little kists next to them with a small child next to them, actually built right into their same kist. This is still an open place. It looks like this particular structure was actually open to one side. There's some of the erosion makes it a little bit difficult to figure that out exactly, but this is definitely accessible also by the community, although individuals are still important. Next slide, please. Persons are inserted into these stone kists. They're left to decay in the free space, and that's indicated by how these bodies slump over. In many cases, we see that the markers are removed at some point, and there are plaster caps underneath them they're cut into. And then there's plaster poured onto the skeletons. If you look at this particular individual here, you can see that, that you can't see the feet at all. It's been covered by a mix of gypsum plaster with clay material in this particular case. Next slide, please. And there's some other examples here of how much pouring gypsum onto these particular individuals is important. And you're basically, in a sense, you're gluing these people down. You're making sure they can't, in a sense, get up and go again. And there's also several of these kists also have little bench features in which these individuals are actually seated on. They're furniture for sitting, possibly forever. The other thing that's important about these stone kist features is they're really substantial pieces of architecture. I mean, these weren't just cuts with some rocks put in them. These were probably built first, and then everything was, all the sediments around it accumulated after that. These are very, very well built. You're in it for the duration. So we have something very, very different going on here at Hema, where the individual is more important. It's still within the community because it's accessible by the community, but now it seems like people aren't moving around, in a sense, after death. And that's no longer part of what's going on in the Wadi Hassa. And one final point I'd like to make, because even though I almost promised I wouldn't do it, is a lot of folks will say, well, this is something we can really look at in terms of the mobility of these people at Chirara, at Hema, through the isotopic record. Next slide, Bill. And I'm not going to go through these data in great detail, but I think there's an important message here. If you look at the red triangles on the left, that's WF16, and the yellow triangles on the right, that's Hema. The other shapes are animals. The blue is Basta. The blue triangles are Basta, and the other little circles over there, that's Beta. The point here is that W16 and El Hema, they're not that far away from each other, but they're far enough away from each other. And for all extent and purposes in the strontium isotopic record, is they look very, very similar. They are different in terms of their variation in terms of Basta, so we have something else going on there. But the important thing to remember here is, Bill, next slide, please, is that if we're going to start thinking about how to trace mobility in through the strontium isotopic record is that Jordan in the southern Levant is not particularly well suited for it. Is that the strontium isotopic variation is extraordinarily low, making it very, very difficult to actually trace movement, let alone even establish variability in the underlying bioavailable strontium in things that don't move, like plants. So I think we've got a lot of challenges here, but I think what we're looking at now in the burial record from Sharara and Hema is we're starting to see an evolution of how people interact with each other, not only in how they think of themselves in the community and mortuary practice, but also perhaps mobility on the landscape as well. Bill?
And just to finish with the mortuary stuff, we've talked a little bit about early middle PPNB beta, the very first phase of that. And we should note that in middle PPNB beta, the burials are a little bit similar to Sharara in that they're all gathered together in one structure. They're not in their nice kists. In fact, they seem to be just laid down in a building occasionally with as much ceremony as putting down a stone slab first, but mostly pretty casually placed inside one building. And the disturbance to the previous burials, which are lying at all sorts of angles and so on, is probably just as people come in and lay down another body. And the trash in the building accumulates as this is going on. It's basically an accumulating midden deposit with people brought in and placed down from time to time. It's very far from what develops elsewhere, the famous placid skull mortuary practices. So what we're seeing is in this trajectory in southern Jordan, and there are plenty of others, but in this particular trajectory, we're seeing something very different, where mortuary practice is reflecting a local trajectory that develops quite independently of what's happening elsewhere. Now, just to go back to the very beginning point we made, these sites are small. This is a reconstruction drawing, I think, by Darko Makarewicz of WF16, and suggesting the number of buildings that may have been in use at any one time, bearing in mind that these buildings all have specific functions, so they're not all residences, placing that in correct scale with the large communal building at the end of the settlement. And you can see that this communal building is out of proportion to the rest of the settlement. As I said at the beginning, you could get the entire population inside one of these quite easily, unlike many of the other communally functioning buildings. And that's to some extent the same story as we have at Sharara, where we have a mortuary, cemetery area, and the extraordinary amount of work and effort that's gone into that at what appears to be a very minor residential settlement with these small number of rather scattered buildings. So at Sharara, what do we have? We seem to have a situation where people bring together their dead. Cheryl's described this process of mixing of people. They're no longer, if they ever were, really seen as strongly individual. They're not. They're communal persons. They're collective persons. And bringing together these fictive families, because that seems, at least with the KISS, that's what's happening, where they place a male and a female skull at the base of this mixed up bag of bones, that you're creating fictive community families. The other thing that it suggests with these many small sites across the landscape is that the PPNA sites in the south of Jordan didn't function as individual settlements. They were closely bound together across the landscape, closely bound through their ritual activities, and closely bound perhaps with Sharara being one hub that operated, at least for a short period of time, to bring together people and the remains that they had been curating on their sites for some considerable time. It shows a lot of planning going on between the sites, a lot of contact between the sites, and a lot of collective activity. What the purpose of a lot of this communal activity and what point there is behind the idea that these are communal settlements and everything's focused on the community, not the individual, is something I think Cheryl and me are still debating. One of the nice things about putting together a talk like this, and this is our first talk where we've discussed Sharara to any great extent, is the debates we have putting these things together and discussing our ideas and testing them, how well they work. So I think, we're at the beginning of this process of understanding Sharara and writing up Sharara and preparing it for publication. But this has been so far a very fun debate that we're having, but we think it matches the previous work we published on the ideas of community, communal, the importance of bringing people together. So I think that's everything we want to say. That's our farewell to Sharara slide there. And of course, I should just remind everyone that as ever, we're very grateful to the Department of Antiquities of Jordan, not only for giving us permission to conduct our excavations, but in this case, inviting us to visit and work at Sharara. And the usual thanks to all of our colleagues who we've worked with on other sites and the funding bodies concerned. Thank you very much from me.
Thank you very much from me too.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Thank you so much, Bill. We listened to another fascinating talk, so inspiring, so good. Thank you so much. And Sharara, is it, do I pronounce it right? Sharara,
Yeah.
oh, that's a fascinating site. And now I understand, Cheryl, why you didn't take us to Sharara when we visited Jordan. So the talk, although the title was on mortuary practices, it was so good. I mean, to listen to other aspects of the PPNA and the early PPMB. Yeah, I mean, the architecture, the channels, stairways, everything was just great, great. It's a great site. I have some questions, but before I ask my questions, I think I have to digest the whole thing now, because it's really there are so many new things, you know, to think about it. So let me ask if there are questions already, to start with them, and then I'm going to ask my questions too. Seda, Melis, are there some questions on the chat, written ones, or who likes to ask questions? Let's do that.
There, Hans-Georg Gerbel, he has a song question.
Yeah. Shall we read, or probably
I don't know.
He likes to ask by himself?
Yeah, probably he wants. Otherwise,
let's see. I can't see him. Hans-Georg Gerbel.
no.
Are you here? Maybe he is left.
Okay.
No, I did not left.
Aye.
Bill, Leslie, Bill, Cheryl, please, do you have ornaments accompanying the burials?
Now, it's very different from your badger burials. There's I don't know if did we find a single artifact in the burial, Cheryl?
There was not a single, not anything at all.
One of the things is that this is one of the reasons why we think it's all happens very quickly. There's very little cultural material kicking around at all. It's not even the usual situation where you're not sure maybe if something's accidentally in the burial. There's that entire platform area is actually very free of artifactual material, apart from just very small scattered odd bits and pieces, and none in the burials.
And this picture from Sharara, is it representative for all the PPNA burials?
No, it's completely unique. I mean, at Hema, you don't have any secondary burials whatsoever. At Hema, there are other types of burials in addition to the ones in structure 6. There is a wide range of burial types, flex burials, extended burials, and so on and so forth, but there are no secondary burials. And Bill can probably speak a little bit better than I can about this at W16, but even the character of the secondary burials at W16, they're very, very different. They're just a few, relatively few skeletal elements, unlike Sharara, where everything is just jam-packed in these little pits.
Yeah, I mean, Dra, and I think Ian's here, he'll remember when we dug at Dra, they were single individual burials again, just in what I think you would tend to see as the classic PPNA style. One or two possible associated artifacts, including a pestle sitting on top of the head of one of them, but hard to be sure in a site very full of artifacts whether these were deliberately placed in the burials or just part of the accidental fill. Fanan, also very few artifacts in the graves, some of them marked with artifacts. A lot of them are marked with broken stone basins that are cut in half and propped up right at the end. I mean, you know, there's the small gypsum lined bag of long bones connected with the skull, which almost looks like somebody's packing things up ready to take them to Sharara. I mean, it's in a very well padded gypsum lined bag there. And we've got the one burial which has got a collection of cranial fragments stacked on top of each other, and one with an excessive number of long bones, but again with no symbolic material artifacts of any sort in with it.
Thank you, Bill.
There's a one question from Joanna Pluck, and do you want to ask yourself, Joanna?
Hi, I may have missed it, but I was wondering what exactly is the evidence that the various dead at Sharara were from different communities? Because I think you maybe implied that there were multiple communities coming together.
This is our hypothesis that we're trying to test, quite frankly. The nature of the site is as such, with this large platform feature, that it seems a little bit hard to imagine that one other community would build that up there and then just go there. Keep in mind also that there are some domestic type structures at Sharara, like we saw, like the fig house and that structure one, kind of against the rocks that you saw early at the beginning. And I think, you know, so clearly those bodies aren't coming probably from that site. They're unlike W16 and unlike Hema and unlike Dra. There's just not much going on at Sharara in terms of domestic structures. So I think our idea here is in the PPNA, there's a lot going on. People are moving around quite a bit. We see that again with, like, for example, all the subsistence stuff. These ideas are spreading quickly and people are moving around on the landscape. And even though these landscapes in southern Jordan, they're rugged, they're difficult, they're challenging, they also have an element of pull about them. You always want to see what's over the other hill. And a lot of these sites aren't that far away from each other. So, you know, I think this is a model that we're kind of testing out here. And I think in order to generate kind of the distribution of skeletal elements that we're seeing and so on and so forth, and the timing, if the structure is being, the platform in the channel is being built very quickly, as we think it is, then you're probably drawing from multiple communities.
Thank you.
I think Tobias has a question.
Hi, thanks Cheryl, thanks Bill for really super interesting talk. I was just wondering, you may have mentioned it and I may have missed it, radiocarbon dates from Sharara. Do you have them, and how do they come out? How long or short-lived are the occupations?
We have some, but we're actually waiting for more to come through the system at the moment, which is obviously being delayed by labs being closed and so on. But at the moment, I mean, they're fairly close together, what we've got, and they're pretty standard early PPNA dates. Nothing to make us think that there's any late PPNA there or anything like that. It all looks like it's part of that same event. At the moment, our argument, however, for the short process of leveling the buildings, building the platform and the burials and so on is more stratigraphic and archaeological.
Thanks.
So may I ask my question, Cheryl? Let me first summarize what I understood. Maybe I missed some, but very briefly. I think diversity defines the PPNA, right? I mean, in architecture, in mortuary practices, and they all have their own dynamics. I mean, those differences, and there are a variety of practices. We can say the same thing for early PPMB, actually, late PPNA, but there is a change, and that change also includes the mortuary practices, right? And if I understand right, the communities became part of a, they also had shared some characteristics. They are different, they have differences in mortuary practices, but they also had some shared characteristics in a wider, in a regional context, right?
That's correct, yeah.
So what is the motivation behind that? I mean, of that being part of that regional network, let's say. What is the just now you talked about mobility, that people became more mobile, going here, and so what is that? Is it a social change? Is it an economic change? What do you think about that? I mean,
I think my tendency to think is it's largely social, actually. I mean, in terms of, one could easily set this up as it's a subsistence issue, and it could be. I mean, because if you're thinking about experimenting with cultivation, for example, you're starting to seek out different places in the landscape in ways that that were different from before. And I think one of the sort of common misconceptions is once you start growing things that you become more sedentary, and that's not necessarily the case. I suspect even especially early on, when you're not really sort of cheering on those growing barleys and wheats with buckets of water and so on and so forth. It's probably very, very hands-off, very experimental. And, so you're seeking out new bits of the landscape, and I could see how that would work, and you're exploiting different resources, and there could be stress on particular animal populations and so on and so forth. Although in southern Jordan, although many of these sites like W16 and Draw, for example, are very broad spectrum, at the same time, it's broad spectrum in the sense that they're just kind of going for everything that's out there. There isn't really a sense of resource stress, which is sort of the classic model that we think about as instigating, for example, animal domestication. So I think it's very social in origin. And I think, when Bill and I are talking about these big community structures, whether at W16 or the sort of more quotidian ones, for example, at HEMA, and the later one at Beta, is people like to interact, and it's about information. And we know throughout the Southern Levant and the Northern Levant, everyone's sort of all connected at different scales and intensities and so on and so forth. For example, Wanho had been talking about the obsidian a couple of weeks ago and so on and so forth. So I think that motivation is very social. This is a very, very active social world. And there could be other things carrying on that. You could be, engaging in the landscape in particular ways for subsistence reasons, but there's social reasons to be out there as well.
Just if I can add one thing to that, I think one of the things we often forget, because we do tend to homogenize the idea of the Neolithic as everybody's Neolithic people. And I think one of the key things to remember is that we're dealing with small scale societies, and that we ought to be looking at fairly small local activities and events and groups of people collectively, not surprised to find that there's a local Neolithic, but actually to be surprised how well connected they are from here all the way up to the Northern Levant.
Trevor, hi. Microphone.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed the first part of the paper. We're having problems with the power or internet here. We had quite a lot of heavy snow today, and got an electrical problem, so I only got in halfway through. what strikes me is I find it a little difficult to understand how people are coming together from different social groups, but on the other hand, each site is producing different kinds of phenomena, yeah, different kinds of burial practices, yeah. It looks to me like different, each society's got its each little community has its own tradition and goes on working that out, yeah. I'm not quite sure I understand how you see the people coming together at Sharara.
I think, I mean, one of the problems is obviously with the preservation of Neolithic sites that we've got, we are to some extent looking at with each site at sort of the tip of a local iceberg in a sense. We're only looking at some preservation, and I don't think we need worry that the people going to Sharara are coming from WF16 and Dra and so on. But we do think, because of the timescale, they're probably coming from more than one settlement. But also, our understanding is that most of these PPNA sites are not 100% at least sedentary, that there's still an awful lot of mobility in the landscape. They're not like, the later PPNB sites, they're not self-sustaining. They don't have the population numbers to be genetically self-sustaining. They have to have ways of bringing themselves together and binding themselves. Now, it may well be, as you say, that the tips of the iceberg we've got at places like WF16 and Dra they look sufficiently apart in some ways that maybe they're not the people who are coming together at a single hub like this. But we do think that it's going to be multi-site, because with these small populations, to get this number of collective families buried all at once, and we think it could be as short as weeks. I mean, it might be a couple of years, but it could be as short as weeks that this event happens. It's so clean and fresh and clear of any normal domestic residue. All the PPNA sites in the southern part of Jordan, without exception, are covered with ash and waste and rubbish and artifacts and this sort of thing. None of that at Sharara. It's incredibly clean. There's clearly a few people living up there in these houses, but it's a tiny population. So they're not generating this. This is definitely coming in from outside, and it's coming in at a short period. People aren't even living there for very long while they're doing this. It's like a work gang comes up and builds the thing, and then they let the word out that we're ready now. You can bring your dead, and fairly soon after that, people arrive and these dead get buried, and then all the material gets shoveled back in on top of them, and then the floor goes in, and it's such a construction, design and build thing, as I said at the beginning, that it looks like it's a pretty short-lived process. So you've got to think about the number of dead involved ready to go, as it were, at the various sites to come up then. One of the things we've always wondered about with things like Dra and W16, which are about 60 kilometers apart, is how connected they are. A lot of the lithic technology is different. They're making, they're all making alkyne points. Everybody's making alkyne points. They're making them up to Commingled, where you excavated. But they're actually making their alkyne points. A lot of them are made differently at the two sites, despite the short distance. So they know what the object looks like, but their manufacturing technique is slightly different. So we know that there's this patchwork of knowledge that's transferred, and it's not all the knowledge. Different bits of the knowledge are transferred. So we know there's interconnectivity in some paths, but not others. So we know there's this mosaic going on. But you're right. I mean, the question a lot of the time is what is the scale of this thing? And that's my last comment. The previous question was, I think we have to put our minds into the framework of very small scale societies that are quite tiny, but also quite mobile, and rely on a local network of some sort.
There are three questions. The Daniela first, and then Yilmaz and Arek. Please, Daniela.
Thanks. Hi. Thank you, Cheryl and Bill, for a great talk. And I just want to share with you my thoughts that I was thinking to myself while I was listening, looking at those weird trenches in this site and the somewhat desolate location. I was thinking to myself, this looks to me, or smells to me like Cyprus, like not people coming together, to the contrary, people running away. this is a community that doesn't want to share with the others. They're behaving differently. They're doing that. That's my gut feeling. But of course, I don't know enough about the site, etc., to really substantiate it. But it's different. It's not like the rest of them. Yeah, that's it. Just wanted to share with you and hear what you have to say about this idea.
I mean, it's an interesting idea. I mean, there are certainly days when after the long 5-kilometer hike from Hamarash to Sharara, we're like, who would ever come up here ever? But I don't know. I mean, my sense is that you're right. It's completely different from all these other sites. Okay, not only by virtue of the strange trench and this platform and these funny burials in there, but by the overall lack of that density of occupation. And so I think I would be into the idea a little bit more if there had been more dense occupation, and then like this was a terrible idea. But there's so few of these domestic structures, it seems at least, and we have good reason to believe that there really aren't very many up there. There were some illicit digging going on up there, and you can see in the profiles that there's no cultural deposits in between across much of the site. And that's in such sharp contrast to draw into W16 and Hema, is that I would think if they decided it wasn't any good, I don't know, if you'd have expected sort of more people to collect and say this was a bad idea, rather than just a couple of, a few domestic structures, and then they hightail it out of there. I don't know, Bill, what do you think?
Well, I think, I mean, and the questions appeared in the chat from Ellen Belcher about if it's not a year-round site, how it is that these shallow pits are not disturbed by animals. And I think that, again, is part of this thing. It's not an occupation site. It's not open for a long time. That red floor goes over those shallow burials very quickly, so you don't get disturbance. I mean, and perhaps they're deliberately so. So that again, I think that's pointing out how short-lived this activity is. But I do think, I mean, if there were refugees, from the rest of the PPNA, they didn't like what was going on elsewhere. They didn't like the stuff other people were doing, that domestication or whatever. I know people have talked about this as a context for Cyprus. I just what did they go and do up there? They didn't go and maintain a hunting and gathering life. It's very difficult up there. They also, I mean, were they refugees against PPNA rubbish? Because they go up and have this clean living thing where they don't generate any rubbish. They don't generate any food. They don't generate any rubbish. It doesn't look like a community of people who are actually living there. I mean, you have to have food, and you almost certainly produce rubbish. They're not, then even if you're refugees, you don't go and stop eating.
Okay, Yilmaz, do you want to ask yourself?
Again, I am interested in the adult and sub-adult burial treatment. Is there any differences for treatment for infants and sub-adult between PPNA and PPNB?
Between the PPNA and the PPNB, I don't think so much. I'm trying to rack my brains a little bit on this. I mean, I think what's interesting is in the PPNA, at least at Hema, and also it looks like at W16, is that infants are in general treated poorly. They are sort of, and I hate to put it this way, but kind of tossed into fill, or they're put in construction dumps, and they're not put in a proper burial in a sense. And we see that kind of repeating over and over again at Hema, with the exception of one individual that I showed in that mortuary structure 6, which was a very unusual case. But to my knowledge, it doesn't seem very different. I can't quite recall how many infants are buried at, for example, Ain Ghazal, which would be my closest sort of reference point.
Okay, Arek, are you still here?
Yes, so thank you.
Hi.
You see, I'll try to switch it on. Okay, thank you for the great talk, and Cheryl and Bill. I mean, my sort of question is more general one, because you just sort of mentioned in passing the sort of similarities and differences between, let's say, the late PPNA and the beginning of PPNB. And you even mentioned there was a couple of sites in northern part of the area that you presented that they were like used and occupied at the same time. So what are similarities and differences between the two, and how do you sort of define this sort of transition from PPNA and PPNB in southern Jordan?
We're primarily suggesting that there's two parallel processes. So you have, and it's a pretty new discovery that Sumio Fuji made at Jehera, where he found basically an early PPNB site that has very similar material culture to what you'd find in the northern Levant. So he's got something that, if ever you were going to make the case, that looks like a migrant population have come and they've set up their new settlement from scratch here. And particularly the lithic assemblage is classically northern. Architecturally, it's more similar, it's quite similar to what's going on in the late PPNA, but they are fairly simple constructions, so not too difficult to be similar, I suppose. What we had been discovering before that happened, and in part we were looking at this long-standing question about, if there is no early PPNB in the southern Levant, does the PPNA continue all the way through, and does it come to a halt when northern migrants arrive, or does it evolve itself? And we had found, particularly at WF16, and perhaps particularly with the work of Sam Smith, looking at the transitional development of the chipped stone, and we get it rising through the stratigraphic record there, is that the chipped stone does indeed change. It's not just the peculiar disappearance of all the projectile points, the Alkion point in particular. It's also that they start to use opposed platform technology, not the same as the famous naviform technology, but it's, again, as I was just saying, it's like they've got the idea, the broad concept, but they're just working out their own way of doing it. And chronologically, the dates from this late PPNA seem to overlap with the early PPNB and go right up, so there's no real chronological gap before the earliest dates of the middle PPNB. So it does look like you've got the two things happening in parallel. And again, you know, we shouldn't be overly surprised. I mean, we shouldn't have this assumption that there's some nice, neat record of cultural periods and so on, because we're talking about people and societies and doing their own thing. So it does look like communities of people, probably from the north, arriving. They're arriving. I mean, I think Sumio's point is that this isn't it's not the very end of the early PPNB either. It's a bit more time depth to it than that. So it's not a very short, you know, not a tiny short-lived transition. It is people probably living in parallel for a while. But, you know, we've got a change of architecture in the late PPNA, which is, and the thing is that we've got more than one site there. I mean, there's only the one early PPNB site in the south of Jordan, and there's possible ones in the north. But in the south of Jordan, we've got several of these late PPNA sites, which all do the same with their lithics. They all do the same with the architecture, where they stop being semi-subterranean, come above ground, freestanding stonework and so on, and in many ways start foreshadowing the architecture that you see at Beda and things like that, with big circular buildings, fairly thick, heavy stone walls and so on. So that we can see that trend coming along. But of course, in Beda, they do adopt the northern lithic technology to a great extent. So it looks like they come together.
Overlap, yeah. Okay, thank you. Then thanks.
Başak has a question. Başak burada mısın? Okay.
Evet buradayım.
Okay.
Pardon, sesi açamadım da. Herkese merhaba. Just a sec. Hi. First of all, thank you very much for the great talk. What I would like to ask is about the depth of the burial in Shara. So you said that they're about 15 and 20 centimeters depth, so very shallow pits. It's actually not even enough to cover a defleshed skull. So I was wondering, actually, they were brought there and just left open for kind of a ceremony or some kind. Do you have any evidence? Were they really covered, buried, apart from the ones that with the markers, of course?
Sure.
And also, sorry, I was also wondering if it's the same case for the semi-articulated ones with the vertebral columns and the limbs. Was it again very shallow pits, or it was a little bit deeper? Thank you.
So I have to apologize because I think I wasn't being entirely clear. So the pits that were very shallow were in that central area around the kist, and those were about 15, 20 centimeters. And none of those actually had a full cranium. There was one that had 3 of sort of cranial vaults kind of tucked up against the stones from the kist. But I think, you know, using my face as a scale, you know, those were maximum, those vaults were about that high. The rest of it was quite shallow. So all of those were about, you know, 15, 20 centimeters. Whereas the kist, on the other hand, the kist was quite deep. That was probably, I don't know, that was about 40, 50 centimeters deep actually. And the other pit that had the other skulls, the one that was flipped upside down, that was next to the wall, that was also quite deep. That was probably about 40 centimeters deep also. So I misspoke on that. So I was just referring to those central area ones. Now where the vertebral column was, that was very interesting because that was a very broad, it was very, very broad pit. It was like the pit was almost too big actually. And we kind of lost the edge of it because it was actually cut into gravel that was pre-existing at the site. So it's very hard to trace that. But that was probably that was a bit deeper, and it was also probably about 25, 30 centimeters. I have to check the measurements on that. So that definitely, that vertebral column had a very good chance of being completely covered. And I think also for those more shallow pits, those were also probably covered as well, albeit with not a lot of sediments. I mean, we're looking at the red floor wasn't preserved directly there, but based on estimates from the profile, there was probably, and Bill can correct me if I'm wrong on this, maybe about, you know, 10, 15 centimeters of material above that. So it was covered, but it wasn't particularly deep by any means. The one on the edge that was next to on the exterior that wasn't within the platform area, but that was on the edge, kind of the hillside there, that I have no idea because the erosion was so bad on the side of the hill there.
Okay, well, what I thought was, because you said it's, and it showed it's such a painstaking way, and they're bringing all these dead inner sacks in order to, so obviously it's very special. So maybe they were doing some kind of ceremonies, feasting and that kind of stuff, and displaying those things, those bodies or whatever they meant to them, I don't know. So that's actually what came to my mind.
Yeah, go ahead, Bill.
I think one of the things that when Cheryl was describing it, which I think argues that they were covered up pretty quickly, even though only by a shallow layer, and then the floor went on quickly, is that it does look like these are very tightly packed, and in some cases just sacks of bones tipped up and buried, and they aren't scattered. There's no sign that anything, whether it's animal, human, any activity at all, has scattered any of these things. They remain incredibly tight, these bundles of bones. And I think the only way you can really see that happening, other than over the most extremely short period, is that they were covered very quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Rula, hi. Rula has a question.
Yes, I have a question. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm just following up on Başak's talk here, and about would you call this place a communal cemetery? If you are talking about they're collecting the bone elements of different individuals and bringing them to bury them at the site. And my next question is, well, did you manage to do a minimum number of individuals? Have the bones been analyzed to know how many individuals actually is represented in each one of those piles of graves? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly it's a communal burial ground, and as we, sort of argued, is that we think that they're collating, they're bringing together skeletal elements from communities, and they're bringing them up there, and so then you have also representation from multiple communities, and that's something that sort of needs to be further tested, but it certainly, I think, is communal in nature. Also because there's this level of animosity of the material that's there. Again, we have all these skeletal elements, long bones and finger bones and so on and so forth, that they're very hard to assign to individuals, especially after time has gone by. And skulls and the crania, one could argue that they're more individualistic, but they also sort of lose their sort of personal assignment as time goes by as well. And I think it is interesting that you have male in the cases where you have male, in the cases where we have skulls in those pits, in the kist in the pit, that's a male and a female. I think it's very interesting. In terms of calculating the MNI, I've done a very basic one. It's usually one has 4, another one has 3, one has 7. But right now what we're doing, we're at the stage of actually, we have to lay everything out and really take a look at everything. It's very, very difficult because, as you can see, the bones are very poorly preserved. And truth be told is, when you're excavating these bones don't have any collagen left in there anymore. And so they are so absolutely fragile. So we're reviewing all of the material that we have now, going through all the photographs and everything. And, we have a basic MNI, but can we do a better one? We're working on it.